Right, well, hello, good evening, and welcome. I am Guy Leech. I've got a slide about me, which I don't normally have, but I've got to put one up anyway. Yes, I know I don't look old enough, but I've been actually coding for 5 decades now. Started in 1980, and my day job is predominantly writing PowerShell for software vendors like Controller, Flexible IT, who have a lot of interesting products in the, well, certainly the Azure space now as well. Sort of taking traditional on-prem stuff, particularly the Citrix and that sort of space into Azure. So that's how I've got into Azure in the last sort of year or so. So what I want to do is show you how to drive the REST API through PowerShell. Any PowerShell people? I'm not going to test you. It's all right. It's fine. It's very easy to use it there, but the beauty of this is these scripts are which I'm going to be using, and really to show you what comes back more from Azure, so I can set breakpoints, go look at the headers, look at the body. Isn't this interesting? And interesting in a technical sense, rather than telling the people out there at the bars about it. Yeah, trying to make jokes and I'm losing my thread. Yes, you can believe I'm that old, okay. So why would you use REST through PowerShell for that? There are other options. For instance, I'm doing some stuff for one of those customers at the moment where I'm actually using the Azure PowerShell modules, so things like AZ desktop virtualization for the AVD, although all the calls have still got WVD in them for backward compatibility. But then other ones I used REST. So why would I want to use REST for these? Well, the main reason for the one customer is because their customers then have other end customers who are IT shops, operations, etc. If you say to them, we need these PowerShell modules installing on there, they go, what's a PowerShell module? They might be able to feed an MSI into SCCM, but that's about as far as they can get. So trying to keep them up to date and that sort of thing, stuff is very difficult. So what we actually do is use REST, because there's no prerequisites. As long as I've got an internet connection, I've got PowerShell which can do REST stuff, then we can do it, no prerequisites. So it gives us more portable code if we need that, if we want to run it on different platforms. And the other thing is, in terms of portability, once you can do REST with one vendor or cloud or product, it doesn't have to be cloud stuff, you can reuse the principles to a degree. That's why I've got this note down here for other ones. So I've done, did I start off with, no, I started off doing VMware REST stuff. I think it was my first bit for VMware Horizon hosted on Azure. So that was actually talking to the VMware API via REST, not the Azure API. Then I did some Citrix stuff. Then lastly, I came to Azure. But once you kind of know how to do stuff with REST, it's pretty easy then to move vendors and products. The main things that differ are subtleties in the URLs, which we'll talk about, and the authentication. Authentication is always a bit of a pain, particularly if there aren't good samples around. And that's all I realised that's a thread that's now, background thread that's now just come in. What I was going to say is the scripts I'm using are publicly available. You don't have to sign up, you don't, or anything for that. So you can take those scripts, and because I've put a lot of the functionality in functions, you can literally take those functions and go, actually, I'm going to call that API or that REST endpoint with these parameters. You don't have to worry about driving the REST side of things. And some of the other things I've put in there, for things like retries, because as I found out recently, okay, so if you've got the wrong parameters or haven't got permission, you're going to keep getting the error. But what I found when I was doing a script to read Azure activity logs recently was sometimes it times out, sometimes it gives you errors. So do I want my script to fail then and the customer to run it again, or do I actually then want to build in a retry mechanism? Well, again, because it's all in the function, you can say, well, actually, I'm not going to bother with retries. If it fails, it fails. I'll report back. If not, well, I'm going to retry every X milliseconds. Again, where X is not hard-coded, because hard-coding is a devil's work. It's a nice little pulpit to each one, isn't it? And another reason to use REST in the Azure space is I feel it's faster. But what I'll show you later is a technique where you can actually see what the Azure PowerShell commandlets are doing. So if the documentation lets you down, or you don't find good examples of what it is you need to do, then you can actually use the Azure PowerShell commandlets as long as there is a PowerShell command to do what you do, run it in debug mode, and you'll actually see all the URLs, the headers, the bodies, so you can kind of reverse engineer it from that. But to be fair, the documentation is pretty good in terms of what there is, but it just lacks sort of examples. But it's pretty easy to play with it, particularly in PowerShell. They've managed PowerShell again over something like C# maybe, although I've got some show my age now and all these newfangled languages all the young people are learning. Is that we don't need to compile it. So we can make a change and do it straight there, or we don't even need to do it in the script. I can do it on the command line and drop breakpoints in, like I'll show you in a moment. And the last point on that slide, which I glossed over very quickly. I can do PowerShell, I can't do PowerPoint, it seems. Was that, yeah, why not? Wasn't really worth going back just for that, was it? That's a hyperlink, so there's various hyperlinks in the slide. I'll make the slides available afterwards. I'll say the code is up there. I'll put a link through it on the controller website. Like I say, there's no need to sign up or anything on there, and the scripts can be used outside of control. In fact, as I'm using them today, when I'm demonstrating them, I won't be using this controller product. I don't actually know how to use it. I just write the scripts and they pay me. So what can we do? Yeah, it's just automate. Yeah, we're all doing automation. We're all doing DevOps. I don't know what DevOps is, to be honest. I don't know if I do a DevOps or not. It just seems to be a phrase that's bandied around. Nobody really quite knows what it means. Some people get quite uppity about it and say, oh, I do DevOps. Do I? No, I don't. I have no idea what DevOps actually is. I just write PowerShell code for customers, and it kind of makes things automated. If that's DevOps, great. If it's not, I'm not bothered. I gave up long ago worrying about when I'm keeping up with all the latest and greatest, like Kubernetes. I thought, oh, I'm missing out on containers and Docker and Kubernetes, but then I do EUC desktop stuff. But despite all these clever backends of Kubernetes and everything else, software as a service, desktop apps ain't going away anytime soon if you work with public sector. Yeah, there are going to be 32-bit apps, 16-bit apps or 2-bit apps around for years to come. So, yeah, I learn new stuff in that space, like REST and Azure, but I'm not worried about all the other stuff in the industry because it's too much. The jack of all trades, master of none. So general workflow for REST API. Sorry, how many? I asked about PowerShell. How many have actually used REST API with Azure? Yeah, cool. So it's this authentication piece, which is pretty critical. So which comes in a number of phases. So first of all, we create an app registration in the Azure portal. Again, that can be scripted. So as I've got a point somewhere later on, is anything you can do manually in the portal, you can do through a script. It's kind of chicken and egg in some ways. How do you get credentials for a script and get it to generate them if you haven't got credentials to actually get those credentials? So we'll get to credentials, which is via an app registration. And again, the usual least user privilege, Lua principles is that you give it as least permission as possible. Again, there's a separate slide on the credentials piece itself. It all uses this standard OAuth 2, but every vendor I've come across who's got a REST API, the way that you authenticate with OAuth is slightly different. And that's the bit I usually struggle with, is trying to find examples of how you actually bloody authenticate. But again, if nothing else, if if it's a browser that's using it, you can use just F12, the browser development side of things. Although, of course, that's hacking according to the Americans, isn't it? So once we've got that taken, we can then just pass it to subsequent REST calls. So once you've authenticated, you kind of forget about it, unless your script is long running. So I wrote a script that gives you MSTSC access to an Azure VM if it's not got Bastion or VPN or anything else, by adding a network group, network security group item for your particular external IP address, putting it in there, running MSTSC, and when MSTSC exits, it rips all that down. So it doesn't leave potential security holes, although because it's only your public IP address that's added, the risk is small. But of course, somebody could be in MSTSC doing this stuff for hours. How long does an Azure token after authentication last? 1 hour, 3,600 seconds, which it does tell you when you get it. So you do have to think, is this script going to potentially run more than an hour? Then I need to build in logic to re-authenticate effectively. But if it's only going to run ideally for a couple of minutes, like most do, then don't worry about the re-authentication side, because they're unlikely to come out with tokens that only last for 10 seconds. And then we do stuff, the technical term, which is, again, setting stuff, getting stuff, changing stuff, creating stuff, destroying stuff, because we all know what we're doing, so that's all fine. We don't need any of these GUIs that go, are you sure? No, oh, right, yes, wrong thing. Some of the other gotchas, as well as your token timing out. The tokens timing out is pretty standard stuff across any API. And we'll see this when we actually drop into the code, is we do need to pass an API version actually in the URL request. It's not straightforward in that it's just one API version. It depends what provider you're talking to. So if you're talking to Microsoft Compute, it's one API version. If you're talking to Microsoft Insights, where logs come from, it's a different one. And which one is it? Actually, I've got some windows somewhere. So I've dropped the resolution so it's easier to read. It means I've got a lot of windows. Where's that gone? I did have a window which had all the versions in, because again, it's a one liner PowerShell. Oh, there we go. They're there. So, for instance, here's something which just queries all the providers, tells you what the latest version is. Although this includes the preview one, I don't like using preview things in release code. Call me old-fashioned. Yeah, I'm old-fashioned. But again, it's easy enough to filter it out. I mean, if you want that command, it's on Twitter. So I can see, for instance, for Microsoft Compute, the latest API version is first of August. That's interesting, isn't it? Right, okay, let me just screenshot that. I can feel a tweet coming on. Not reading that wrong. No, yeah. So the latest version is from 12 days in the future. Okay. So you can see the different providers have different versions. The interesting one is the SQL one. There's been no SQL released one for about 6 or 7 years. The latest one is still a preview. The latest release one was, I think, 2015. It's like, what? So yeah, got the API version which comes in the code, the token expiring, and then multiple pages, which is a change that a lot of vendors seem to have done relatively recently. Citrix didn't do it, now they've done it, which means is, and I'll demonstrate this when I'm getting back activity logs. So I go back and say, give me 10 days of activity logs to this particular resource group. So it doesn't tell me how many there are. It just returns me 100. Oh, there's only 100, exactly. This is when I first knew there was a problem with my code. It's like every time I did it, it was always returning me 100. Well, isn't that interesting? But why is it only showing me stuff back to then, not this far back? Well, you can obviously check it against the portal. That's the other thing you can do with the code is check what you're getting back against actually manually doing it in the portal. So that's when I knew that I've got a problem. Then, lo and behold, you find out there's a way that they effectively paginate the results. So say, here's 100 results, but here's a link to the next set of results. So don't know how many you're going to get, but you just keep calling that URL they give you until the URL is null or doesn't exist in what they return to you. So that's that way you get back all of the other results. And again, this is all encapsulated in that function that you can go and grab anyway, so you don't have to worry about it. Then all the hard work for you. So credentials. Yes, we need them. Yeah. Once you enter the manual. So if you're using Azure PowerShell commandlets and you do a get AZVM and you're not authenticated, it will pop a nice little browser window. Yeah, but what if you've got a script running via a task scheduler at 3:15 in the morning? You don't really want to be there. So that's not really an option for using automation, any flavor really. So we create a service principal. So we create an app registration. It's easy enough in that Azure thing. That's my browser. So I created one earlier in best Blue Peter fashion, which the younger. We got any people on from out of this? I was out of this world, but out of country, because I learned not to make Blue Peter jokes when I was talking to Americans and so on. I learned not to make jokes when I was talking to Americans. So here's an app registration I created today for this. Notice I gave it a very short expiration as well. So this is the application ID for it. So that's one of the components that I will need for the authentication. The other thing that I did was create a secret. So there are ways of doing this with certificates as well, but I tend to use just the application ID, which is the GUID I just showed you, and then an app secret in here. So again, once you've created that app secret, make sure you make a secure copy of that password, because you can't get it. You can see the first 3 letters, which does help. But you think, oh, what you'll end up with having is probably a lot of app registrations and a lot of secrets. It's like which one's which. So keep them secure, and you know, to make sure you know which one's which. You can look up the application ID easily enough, but you won't be able to get password again. So we need to get those. I've fallen for this before, where it's secret ID. There's a secret ID and there's the secret itself. Yeah, don't worry about the secret ID. We don't need that. I've never come across anything that's needed the secret ID. Yeah, but I've fallen down that one before. So it's just the application ID, which is a GUID, and then the secret, which isn't a GUID. And then you just add that account to the access control of the objects that script is going to run on. So if that's going to run various things in a resource group like I've got here, then you want to give it access. And if it's only going to read stuff, you just give it read it. You don't give it one of the built-in roles or custom role, which gives it write access. If it doesn't need write access, don't give it write access. Which is what I started off with. When I first created this one, I created it to demonstrate the logs program, which is one that shows you the authentication and the pagination. Then I used it for the next script, which is creating VMs. Guess what? When I created VMs, yeah, authenticated okay. As soon as I came to call one of the REST APIs to create something, it said no, access denied. But at least the error message is pretty straightforward. It said access denied. So, oh yeah, I need to give it. Well, the easiest way for me, because it was just a test subscription, is to give it contributor at the resource group level. Could have been granular. That was just a quick fix for the demo. But again, least user access. Give it the minimum level that it needs. To the smallest amount of objects, resources, etc. But then you've got to think what happens when the person who set that up, who may or may not have taken a note of the application ID and secret, leave your organisation, leave your customers' organisations. I'm not going to give you an answer here, but bear that in mind. Yeah, what you don't want is the customers I work for. The sector companies I work for didn't change the domain admin password that everybody knew for 7 years, I think, after lots and lots of people had left. And there were still passwords in there which are privileged, which haven't changed even before then. Yeah. So have a plan, ideally cunning, that you can invoke when somebody leaves for these credentials. The way I pass credentials to scripts, either I'll pass them as parameters. I don't like passing secrets or passwords as clear text. Typically use secure strings. The way these scripts work is actually we store them in encrypted files and bring them back in. So if somebody left, what I would need to do is just basically update that credential set for the particular user who was using it. So it was a conscious decision to do it, but it's better to then, because you can then go and delete or disable that account in the portal, or automatically, of course, add it to your leavers process. I'm writing a script for another customer to their leavers process at the moment. Right, so let's go and actually do some demo. Or I'll do a demo and you'll watch it. Ease to be messing it up. Hopefully I've zoomed that enough. A low resolution and zoom, so see, I'm an old traditionalist. I use ISE where it goes, oh, you're not using VS Code. A lot of my excuse used to be, as I did a lot of coding on custom systems when I was more consulting and troubleshooter. So what do you have when you're on a custom site? You know you've got ISE, you don't know if you've got VS Code. Now my excuse is, to be honest, I find VS Code pretty unreliable. I find it either crashes on me or behaves inconsistently. Not to say ISE doesn't. I had all my demos, all my breakpoints, all my command lines all set up ready. A couple of hours ago, came to it and my ISE had hung. So I could kill it and start again. And obviously scripts are safe. It's pretty easy to work out the command lines, but yeah, ISE isn't without its faults. But use whatever tool you're most productive in. Yeah, I'm most productive in this one. So what I will do is, the best Blue Peter fashion is find the command line that I created earlier. It's got lots of stuff on it. But basically, I'm passing a tenant ID. I'm passing an ID to a particular virtual machine only just as a starting point. So basically, I want to go and get logs for this virtual machine, and there are parameters in the script which say, do I just want to get it for this VM only, or do I just want to get it for the resource group only, or I just want to get everything? Again, that doesn't really matter for the sake of the script. So what I've hopefully done when I restarted it, set some, so these are the functions I've got. Yeah, I've set some breakpoints. So let's run that. And I've told it to go 10 days back. The default is 1, just so I can get a lot of results so I can show you the pagination stuff working. So I'm going to run that, and it will stop at this breakpoint here, which is inside the get AZ bearer token. Guess what that function does? Yeah, I've got a note later on. Use meaningful function names, meaningful parameters, just to make things easy to read. And I don't mean for other people you might share the code with. I mean for you when you come back to it in my case, a day's time, but in a week or a month, and you think, what's this? Who wrote this? Oh, I wrote it. Yeah. So try and write it as as humanly readable and understandable as you can, with names and things. I mean, sometimes you're limited. For instance, in these hash tables here, everything on the left-hand side is what I need to pass. So Azure has stipulated that. But what I've got, SP credentials isn't actually a name I like, but I inherited this script from somebody else. I haven't got around to changing it. It's service principal credentials. Well, why don't I change it to service principal credentials? You say, well, that's paying for time. Yeah, but not tab completion in PowerShell. Yeah, it tells sense. It's not exactly difficult. Enter a couple of characters and tab through if you've got multiple things that match it. Yeah, that's one of the things I should really do in this person's function is change that to service principal. I don't like abbreviations. What we need to do here then, so this is, say, using OAuth for the authentication, is actually log in. So using our tenant ID, it's been passed through as a parameter to the function. Again, as per the manual page for this, so RTFM a lot for this stuff. So again, I always like to try and put references into what I'm calling in a comment. So if I need to go and find out the documentation for it, I don't have to go off and use Google or DuckDuckGo. I can use Bing, it's your own fault, but there's a reference there and you go straight to it. Because it'll tell you exactly what you've got to put in your body. And so what we'll see here is that those of you who know PowerShell, you know splatting. It's where you pass a hash table to one of these, which is a dictionary in general terms, which is basically you have a key and you have a value. So it's pairs of things. So this dictionary has something called a grant type, which is a key, and its value is a string called client credentials. So splatting is a cool way of passing parameters from a hash table. But what that will do is expand them all out. So I don't need to do a minus body, minus URI. They're all here. So let me just get that variable. Control C, and paste. That's how I do stuff. So this is the advantage of setting a breakpoint in ISC or VS Code, because I can see what I'm going to pass to that. So invoke REST method is a built-in PowerShell function or commandlet, as we should call it, and you can see what I'm going to pass to it. So that's the full URI with my tenant ID in. The body, again, it's showing it in its good braces because that again is a complex type, if you like. It's another hash table. So I can then go through and look at that. So you can see this is that hash table here that's being filled in. So there, quick make a note of my client secret. This is the one that's going to be, well, automatically expires tomorrow and I'll delete after the demo. So do your worst. And suddenly it's not a customer subscription anyway. And so that's what's going to be passed to it. So that's my, if you remember, because I was going to test you on this, if you can remember the GUID, that's the application ID and that's the secret. Which is actually, I didn't pass them as parameters, they came from a stored file. But again, it doesn't matter. If you're going to store them in a file, just store them relatively securely, not in clear text. So these are stored as something called secure strings in PowerShell, which can only be decrypted by the same user on the same machine. Which, again, if somebody has got local admin, they can reset the password. So yeah, it's levels of risk. Yeah, then you can get into Azure Key Vaults, but it's chicken and egg. So you need some sort of credentials to get to Azure Key Vault. So where are you going to store those credentials? So there's got to be some level of trust at some point in risk assessment. So that will now go and do that. In fact, what we can do is, again, the beauty of just using PowerShell because it's interpreted. I can actually say, oh, I'm going to go and run that directly now. And that's come back with content because I was using a vote rest method. It actually comes back as HTML, but the vote rest method will sort of get the JSON out of that and turn it into PowerShell objects. So it actually gives me, so here's my expires in, doesn't tell me the units, but yeah, almost an hour. Yeah, the clock's obviously ticking. And then the access token, this is the important bit, the access token, that's what we need to pass through to subsequent calls. So if I do an F5 now to resume it, and we've got some verbose stuff at the bottom, which blue on black doesn't work very well. Again, I've gone dark mode, not because it's what the young trendy people do, but trying to save battery life on things. And so I reckon dark mode uses less power to display. How long have I got left on that? 6 hours, 84%. I'm not suggesting I can run for 6 hours. I think 5 would be fine. And this is another breakpoint I decided to put in just to show you again. You know, I said on one of the slides, which is, you know, once you know REST for one thing, you know it for something else. But you may have heard of the Graph API, which is where Microsoft want to push you for all things AD and more in the future. And I hadn't done anything Graph until a couple of weeks ago. Then I needed to do it for this particular script, so I could go and get a whole list of service principals because the activity logs come back with GUIDs for those. So I want to make it a bit more human readable by being able to get a list of those, but I can only do that through Azure Graph. Also Graph if we've got any southerners. And so I had to add that to this code, but I actually found I could reuse those functions I got with minimal changes because REST is REST. Even though it's a separate REST interface to the Azure REST API, it's so similar that it took half an hour to modify those functions, and suddenly I had graph support. So go do the same thing again, but this time we've got subtly different parameters. So this time it's going to actually ask for a graph, and I think it's going to be denied. Yes, there we go. That's what I really want to say here is just literally I've got to try catch an exception has happened. Why has an exception happened? Because that user doesn't have permission. 403. I have seen 1 or 2 403s in your careers. That user does not have permission for graph. So I added them to the resource group, but I also would have needed to add them to AD to give them ability to read AD. I deliberately didn't give them that just so we'd see that here. So we can see that that actually failed. It's a non-fatal error in my script. It just means it can't resolve those GUIDs. Again, script doesn't really matter. This script is really just to show you how we drive Azure through REST. So then we say I put out a sensible warning. So what we've done now is we've called into the activity logs with a query, which is, again, we're in this lovely invoke Azure REST method function. And we've set up a sort of call. So again, let's have a look at the REST parameters. We can't use keyboard. So we can see the URL, or URL, I suppose I should call that. Now is into the Microsoft Insights provider, which, if you notice, has a subtly different version from the Microsoft Compute one. In fact, that's old. I noticed that today from those other scripts I've run. So one of these 2 scripts I'm going to use, I've updated it. Because what I do for the API versions is when I'm passing them through from the, when I'm calling those functions, what I do is build the string. If you see that one right at the top, so that one's the Microsoft Insights one that I've just called. So if we look at this bit of the string here, you can see API version. Again, I use a variable. $insights API version, so I define that once at the top of the script. So if I want to change that, I change it in one place. Yeah, don't hard code things. It's one of Guy's golden rules for any sort of programming. Hard code stuff, it's not a good idea. I'm in battle with some Citrix developers over that at the moment. Oh, winning, but just, they don't realise that yet. So the API, we do need, if you don't pass an API version, it will fail your call. So you need to pass an API version. And there's no sort of pseudo thing for latest. But if you want to programmatically get what the latest is, then you can do it through that couple of lines of couple of statements in PowerShell pipeline together. But if you use one which is old, it shouldn't matter. The idea of having the API version is if they add new stuff, new functionality, and you call an older one, and that some of those newer things are mandatory, but you don't specify them because you're using the older one, then it won't fail that call. When I'm writing the scripts, I always use the latest. But if I come back to some of these scripts in 2 or 3 years, will I worry about the API version if the scripts are still working? No. The only reason I might worry about them is if there's new functionality been added in those APIs. Therefore, I need to go in and use a later version so I can get access to that extra functionality, extra data. Right, where was I in code somewhere? Yes, call stacks and some of these. Oh yes, I was doing the paging stuff, wasn't I? Yeah. So if we go back up to where that pagination stuff was, we could see that we got the result back. So the result from calling that endpoint is here, that line of code. I could have stuck a breakpoint there. So result is the result of invoking that. So if we look at $result, we can see it has a value. So yeah, that's not interesting. Yeah, okay, it's that guy. What was all that? Yeah. Well, that was actually all the entries in there, which is quite a few. So what we'll actually do is we'll have a look and see what members it has. GM, which is get members, which is an alias built in. Great for demos like this because you don't have to type a lot of stuff in. Don't use aliases in scripts because it makes it much harder to understand. You see a GM in a script, is that, what's that? What's that mean? Yeah, whereas you see get-member, even as a non-PowerShell person, you can probably guess that's getting some members of something. So you can see it's got actually the value is a big thing. It's a square bracket means it's an array. How many items are there? Wow, which I'm not surprised if there'll be exactly 100. If I can actually type it. Oh, 200. Oh, it's going to be 200 now. The documentation says 1,000, but I'd always hit 100. But 200. But is that going to break my script? No, because the script doesn't care. If it returns 10, 100, 200, 2,000, yeah, the script will still work because what we get is this next link. So the result is what it's returned to us after we've done the query, saying, give me the logs from this date for this particular resource group, this particular VM, depending on what your filter is. But if it passes you a next link, then that is the link that you need to call with all the same headers and auths and bearer tokens, that sort of stuff. And if you look at that, it's very similar to my previous query. But it's got some extra stuff on the end, which is basically saying, yeah, give me the next lot, which is expected. You can't say, here's results 0 to 199, give me 500 to 1,000. You can't be picky. You just say, give me the next lot, give me the next lot. And all you do is iterate around until next link is either empty or doesn't exist. And again, your code needs to make sure that it doesn't fall over when you try and access next link and it doesn't exist. Yeah, see, again, that's all in that function, so you don't have to worry about that. So error handling, that's on one of Guy's golden rules. Always think about what happens if this is going to fail? What could possibly go wrong? No user's going to be stupid enough. Yeah, users will be stupid enough to do stuff. So, does your code work if no items are passed back? If one item's passed back, and if more than one? I say one and more than one because if you use PowerShell and use arrays, PowerShell's got this horrible habit of flattening single element arrays. So it's not an array. So you write code to deal with it. There's ways and means around it. So that's how the pagination stuff works. It just gives you a link back and you just keep calling it. It's actually pretty simple. Hey, you want some more PowerShell? PowerPoint? Yeah. I think I've probably done all these, hopefully. Yeah, point this link. But again, that code will all be there for you anyway. So next link. Oh, and another sort of fairly standard PowerShell thing is with arrays, if you use plus equals, which means add this. Sorry, sorry. I need some water. A bit of water. So what I mean is, if you've got an array and you say $array plus equals $new items, where new items is also an array, but you've already got some stuff in array, then that should make your new array, the two things combined. But what that actually does, make a whole new copy of the original array and bang the other new stuff on the end of it. So it's quite inefficient. As you grow the array, if you're into 1,000 items, because this will come back eventually in about 2,000 items, I think, then that gets slower and slower and uses more and more memory. So there are other ways around that, which is to use these built-in collections. Again, this script uses them. So if you want examples of how to use these collections, they're in there. But actually, a much simpler way than using these .NET collections, you've probably heard of .NET, is to just output the results to a pipeline. What do I mean by that? Well, if we go back to that script, and so we're in a loop here, which is getting the results. You see, this is actually what's putting the results out for that function. I'm not building an array, I'm just outputting the result. Next time I'll output the next result. Except it's this line for the activity logs that's going to be called, because I'm telling it to give me the value. I don't want all the other stuff on there for the activity logs. I just want the actual activity logs. I don't want these next links or any of the authorization headers. But that's enough. That will actually form an array. Because at the calling end, and find out where I called it from. Yeah, this sort of thing. So again, this is how I avoid array flattening. That's the function we were in, which returns multiple items, and then I just assign them to an array. I don't have to build the array in the function I'm calling. I just get it to return all the results, and then I stuff them into an array. I strongly type things, which I've had falling outs with other PowerShell MVPs over, because I come from a C++ world where you do have to strongly type things. People say, well, because you put open parentheses, that tells it it's an array, so you don't need to do that. I'll say, bit on the braces. Although I haven't got any braces on, so I'm not really advocating that well, am I? But that means even if there's only one element, it will still put it in an array, which is that a problem? It can be, depending on how your code works. So that's something called demoing all that one. And again, so these slides will be available. So I just gave you the code example. That's what I mean. Assign the results of your array, of your loop. So it could be a for loop or a do while. Mine was there. Okay, so another thing that will happen in Azure is you have these asynchronous options. Options? No, that's an operations guy. Should put glasses on. What's an asynchronous operation? Well, something's not going to be immediate. Like if I'm creating new VMs, you probably don't want that call to hang, as in to wait for completion. Well, you might want the option, and most of the PowerShell commandlets equivalents have an option to wait or not wait. Because we say, well, I can't do anything until it's built, so I'll wait, fine. But in this script, for instance, another one I'm going to show you now, is I'm building any number of VMs from an existing VM. So I say, I want to create 10. I don't want to create one, wait for it to finish, start creating the second one, because that's going to take potentially 10 times longer or thereabouts. Then start the creation of one, start the creation of the next, start the creation of all of them, then come back and see how they're getting on and start waiting for them at that point. So that's where asynchronous operations really help. And the overlapping, the parallelism here, fortunately, is given to us by Azure. If you've ever tried to do any parallelism, as in running multiple threads in PowerShell 7 is a bit easier because you've got for each dash parallel, so it will do parallel stuff. But in the past, you either have to use jobs, which is slow because they start a whole new PowerShell instance, or you use something called run spaces, which are a bit of a black art. But once you've got it, it's great because you just copy and paste the last time you use run spaces once you understand them. But here we don't have to use any of that stuff at all because Azure is doing the multi-threading. We've said create this VM and it go, yeah, I'm going to go and create that for you. And this is how we now need to track it to make sure, because if we need to do something, so this script, for instance, will create new VMs, but if you've given it domain credentials, it will then domain join it as well. Obviously, it can't domain join it until the VM has come back and said, yes, I've finished building. Otherwise, if it's still building it, the domain join is going to fail rather spectacularly, or slowly, or not even give you an error. So what I want to be able to do is to track the progress of that VM creation and then be able to do the domain joining. Sometimes when you create a VM, if you just create a VM, that's it. No need to track it. Again, it depends on your needs. So what happens is when you call the REST method that creates the VM with all the various parameters, and again, we'll see that in the demo in a moment, it will either return, doesn't seem to be much consistency here, I found, either, so we all know that 200 is a, yeah, everything's okay, error success, yeah. Well, not error success, that's 0, but I'll get into that. Yeah, 200, it worked okay, everything's great. 201 is a, yeah, I created something, and 202 is, yes, I accepted the request. So it kind of uses them interchangeably. It probably depends on which developer wrote that bit of code, but my code basically says is that, you know, is it 201 but less than 400, because we all know what the 400 error range is. It's not good news generally. So check for one of those status codes. One of the gotchas here, unfortunately, is that invoke REST method, that's just little cotton socks in Windows PowerShell, which I'm mostly using, mainly because my software vendor customers, their customers aren't rolling out PowerShell 7. They're just sticking with Windows PowerShell for now, even though Windows PowerShell 5.1 is deprecated, isn't going to be updated, other than security fixes. Everything's going to be PowerShell 7. Not everybody's rolled out PowerShell 7. I mean, I'd love to run PowerShell 7. And I'd have to use VS Code because I can't use PowerShell IC. But with Windows PowerShell, the invoke REST method, unlike in PowerShell 7, doesn't give you any headers. So, and then also for certain of these methods, so these asynchronous ones, it doesn't even return you a body, let alone headers. It'll go, yeah, error 200, well, status 200, yeah, it was all good. But then that's it. Ah, okay. How do I track it? Well, then we have to switch to invoke web request, which fortunately takes exactly the same parameters, more or less. Certainly the ones we're calling. So I can actually switch out calls. Oh, God, he's got a bit of a crap voice. And this is considered not the first time I've heard myself before. Invoke, yeah, so we swap out invoke REST method for invoke web request, because invoke web request gives us all the raw results, and we can actually pick the content out of that. And again, I'll show you what I'm waffling on about when we get the get into the demo. But PowerShell 7 takes care of that. Fortunately, they realised that was a deficiency in Windows PowerShell, so 7 is fixed. So the result headers, which we'll see in the demo in a moment, it gives us a URL. So a bit like that next link in the pagination results. This is another link, which is for facial operation ID. So, yeah, give me the status of this. And most of the time, I'll come back and go, in progress. So I call that every 10 milliseconds. No, I don't call that every 10 milliseconds. Why would I call it every 10 milliseconds? That's not going to help Azure itself. It's not going to help your internet pipe. Whereas, depending on where it's running from, it's not going to help rate limits. How often do you want to poll? Well, something I actually found out today when writing slides for this, although I wrote the script a couple of weeks ago, is in the return headers, it also returns you how long you should wait before you check again. It's not going to enforce that. But as I say, that's what it picked, 10 seconds is what I picked. But yeah, rather than polling very frequently, polling is a devil's work. You know, generally, when coding, one doesn't want to poll because then you see CPU creep up and things like that. You want wait for events to trigger, which you can do a lot of in Windows. But because this is something happening in Azure, it's a bit hard for it to notify you. Maybe webhooks could be used, I don't know. But certainly here, what I do is I just poll this async operation URI every 10 seconds, although guess what, it's a parameter. I could override that, so I actually do it every 30 seconds. I'm not that fussed, just to keep the the internet traffic and Azure requests down. So I get that URL and I keep going in until it isn't in progress. It'll either be successful or failed or error or something like that. I think I'll have it in my code. But that's what I found today. This retry after is in the header. It doesn't specify the units, but it says 10, so I'm assuming it's 10 seconds. One's going to come back every 10 minutes, which is a little bit a long polling period. Yeah, so that's what I just said. And then when status comes back, it's failed, and there's probably no point in trying a domain join, for instance, in this scenario. But if it succeeded, yeah, let's go and do that domain join. So we switch over to the demo. Stop that script, switch to the other one, which is new VM1. Find the call to it. Yeah, so sorry, with PowerShell, if you're in PowerShell immediate, so in a PowerShell console, you can use Control-R to search your history. And that will search it, not just for this session, but you've got a persistent profile since whenever. Even though I changed laptops a couple of months ago, I brought my PowerShell history over, so I've got about 10,000 items in it, so I can search all of them with Control-R rather than having to do cursor up, yeah? Or F7 if you're in CMD. Control-R in ISE toggles the code at the time. Doesn't help you search. But what you can do is do a hash, as I did here, and then type the first few characters, then tab complete, and it will go looking through your command history. So this is found a new VM. Command line that I was testing earlier, my tenant ID, I'm passing it the ID. This is what you get from the JSON view in the portal. You know, you go JSON view for your VM, you can just right click that, left click and copy it. So this is passing a minimum number of characters. So this is going to call the machine's Bradford, Brad demo, local admin, Bradley A, new local password, and you can read that yourselves. And let's go back again. That's magician's fashion prove there's nothing up my sleeve. So let's look at my virtual machines. So at the moment, I haven't in this. No, I'm not filtering on resource script against my whole subscription. There's no VMs beginning with a B. Yeah. So what we'll do here, hopefully I've got my breakpoints again set properly, so we can look at the continuation stuff. So this is going to go away, do some stuff, do some authentication. It actually creates a GUI. That's because I've written this for control up, whose current mechanism doesn't display anything until the script's finished. So you're going to sit there thinking, what's going on? It's taking a long time. And then 10 minutes later, it pops up, successful fail. So I wrote a GUI that pops up alongside their console to do that using Windows Forms. Again, that uses multi-threaded stuff, run spaces. Don't worry about that. And if you get the script, leave that stuff alone. Just worry about the REST API side of things. So this is now stopped at a breakpoint. I'm trying to read that blue on black. Once it's done, it's created network interfaces. So again, basically the source VM goes and looks at, oh, what's your networking look like? What's network security groups? What size of machine are you? And goes basically clones it. And if it's come from a gallery image or one of your own images, it will create it the same. So it actually use that same disk. So effectively, it's not cloning because you're not taking an exact copy of that VM as it is now, but it's creating another one of those when it was first created. So this now is going to call the new VM URI, which I'll just type it down here, easy to see. It's got a larger font. I hit return. So again, it goes to my subscription. Again, things like management.azure.com probably isn't going to change. But when I construct the URI, that's just as a variable set at the top. So if I need to change it, I'll change it once. And this will just say basically virtual machine, because it's doing this is doing a put to actually start creation of that new VM. So if I F10 that, which is to step over that, goes away, thinks about it, I get the result back. So let's see if I've got a result, first of all. Yes, it's always a good sound. But again, I would test for null first, which is in the code, which we see. Because I put this no rest at the end, that's a parameter for this Azure REST method I've shown you a few bits of. which switches it to using that invoke web request rather than invoke REST method, so that I can get back particularly the headers, which I say if you're using Windows PowerShell 5, you can't get through invoke REST method. You have to use PowerShell 7. Use PowerShell 7 if you can, by the way. It's much better. If nothing else, most things, it's much faster. So if I look at these headers from my result, see the headers again are one of these dictionaries or hash tables effectively. So I have a key and then a value. So you can see this retry after I mentioned is 10, which I'm guessing is seconds. So again, I've got some logic in the code on that show you, which says, look at that, and if that's greater than the retry value that's been specified on the command line or is default, then use this one instead. I don't know if this dynamically changes if Azure has problems or capacity issues. So I'd like to think it might do. It doesn't, to be honest. It's probably hard coded somewhere. But that's not hard coding. But the important bit is this Azure async operation. This is what I now need to track. So that this URI for creating it is a one-off. It says, right, go and start creating it. In fact, if we go to the Azure portal and I do a refresh, there we can see Brad demo 01. Oh, it's actually, already finished building it. So it just depends. Different times of day, as you probably know, things can take massively different amounts of time. I was hoping I'd get in, but I'm obviously waffling too slowly, and that would show it was creating it. But that's actually already created that one. Not domain joining these either, just for the sake of time. Not far off the end now, don't panic. I was only joking about 5 hours. So we need to track this Azure async operation, and we see what it actually is. It's Microsoft Compute, but it's an operations with a GUID. So what I now then need to do is, this is the logic here actually, which does the retry after, looking at the retry after to see $retry after. It's just a string that's, again, I don't hard code anything if I can avoid it. So retry after is just retry after. Let's see if we hover over it. We might see if I hover over it. Okay. So let's just step through there. So we can see the result code was 201, that blue and black. So we can see the status code is 201, which is created, I think I can remember which is which, created and accepted. But the point is, it worked, but it's an asynchronous operation. So that's what I'm saying on the code. As long as that status code is less than 400, what happens if it's a 300? Not sure. There is a 300 and it is valid, but I can't remember what 300 is. It is something I've seen it. Stuff like IIS. Some scars down here, I think some of the IIS ones. So we check that we've got a header, and then what we'll do is we'll remember that, again, async operation is just a string. When you're only using string once, it doesn't really matter about hard coding, but if I was using it in several places, it's much easier to define it once, so that if I need to change it, I can change it in one place. That's just the way I work. And so it still work loosely. So now I've got that, what I can do is to, what we'll do in a loop is to basically just keep calling it. Let's continue that. Sent the second one off, so let's have a look. So the status now is succeeded because that was is that the first VM? Because I build them into an array so I can keep track. That's what I'm saying. If it was creating 10, it'd go create 1, create 2, create 3, create 4. Then I come back. This is a loop here which says, right, let's check on the status of these. So that Azure is doing the multitasking for me. I don't have to do it in this script. I can just go through my array that I've saved of each of those operations. So basically, each of those async operation URLs I've saved in an array with a bit of other information so I can keep track of it. So I can see, for instance, the item in my array for this one. I set 8 on the selection, it will just run it for you. So yeah, that was the Brad demo 01, that's already finished. So in fact, I'm going to F5 that, see if I can catch the second one before it's finished. Yeah, so that one's still in progress. So if we go back to the Azure portal, if I find a refresh button quick enough, so let's get rid of that because I don't want to refresh that one at all. Oh, stupid. yeah, so you can see Brad demo 02 is still creating. So that's why it came back as in progress. Again, I'm just doing case intent, deliberate case insensitive. You've always come back to case. But when you've been doing C and C++ for as many years as I have, you don't want to be bitten by case sensitivity because it's evil. Whereas PowerShell lulls you into the false sense of security that everything's case insensitive. Well, I tend to override it, belt and braces again. Yeah, there's scars on this arm from unnecessary case sensitivity in programs before now. It's horrible. That's why things like good like Windows registry keys and values aren't case sensitive. Things are a lot easier. So if the status is not equal to, so status was in progress. What am I doing here? I'm looking when I started doing that VM because I, as well as creating that, remembering that async operation, and what time I started, so I can do an intelligent timeout. So there's a maximum wait timeout in seconds. That hasn't timed, if it's not timed out. Not removing the element that goes around the array again, it finishes the array, and then we'll sleep for retry period seconds, which is 10, because I read that from the header, although the default I pass into the script is 10 anyway, just in case there wasn't one in the header. I wouldn't want the script to fail just because Microsoft hadn't told me how long to wait for. I can make an intelligent guess and, you know, wait for 10 seconds or so. And that will go round again, so let's find that. So we'll do the sleep. Notice even with things like start sleep, if you use PowerShell, I could have got away with not using -seconds because that's a default parameter, but I use -seconds so people can look and realize that it is seconds. So never assume or use positional, that's called a positional parameter where you don't name it. Again, it makes it much more difficult to understand how a script works because you've then got to know what the parameters are and what order they are. The classic one is the copy. Is it? Yeah, it's yeah, that's stupid. You wouldn't write a copy which is destination source, but it, you know, wouldn't be impossible. But you'd want to say copy minus source this minus destination that. Then there's no ambiguity at all. You know, make your code foolproof. Well, as foolproof as you can anyway. Obviously, we've all met some pretty big fools in our lifetimes in this business. That's not pulling out of this business. In fact, this one still seems to be going. So we'll have to find it. But again, eventually it will come back and go. It won't be in progress. It either succeeded or failed, and then there's logic here with, you know, so if succeeded is good, anything else is bad, and then I'll produce an error and go, yeah, it's not good. Yeah, well, it's finished now, so it just goes through the logic. Yeah, finish creating that. I've told it I wasn't going to domain join because I could pass optional domain joiner credentials and domain to the script parameters. I didn't. Moves it in the list and eventually just drops out because there's no items left in the array. And that's it, it's finished. So that's how we track the async operations. We get back status of 201 or 202. It gives us URL and headers, which we have to use if we're using Windows PowerShell 5 with invoke REST method, invoke web request, and then we just keep calling that URL with a sleep in between. Yeah, don't miss out sleep. Oh yeah, but I'll get it, I'll see it 10 seconds quicker. Does it really matter? Compared with how much internet traffic you're going to create, how much load on Azure, you know, there are rate limits. You can see. So, yeah, that was that. And finally, most of these are hopefully already mentioned as they occur to me, because although it's not often I present when somebody's actually got fewer slides than me, because my slides are usually to remind me what to waffle and demo about, and then is you know, something for people to take away afterwards. Go, what was he saying about that? Oh yeah. So the URLs and things like that. So I mentioned this before. If you want to do to see how something works. So if I use my one PowerShell in Windows, let's have a look. So that's what I meant there. Is yeah, I'm just calling an AVD, even though it says WVD in it. What does 5 greater than do? It redirects just debug. You know, you normally do greater than, that should redirect something called standard output. 5 actually redirects just the debug output. And then we look at that file, because I again corrected that earlier. It's called debug tools. Then we'll see we get all the, even though you don't see any of the rest at the PowerShell level, this shows you the headers, bodies, what you send, what comes back. So that's what I'm saying, that if you can't find good documentation or examples, use -debug if you've got an Azure equivalent PowerShell commandlet. Cape failures, particularly transient ones, like I said, with the activity logs, I suddenly found it was giving errors every now and again. So I've got retries in there. It's up to you whether you do that or not. Again, back off for a given amount of time. Try again, get the same error again. Do you try? It's up to you. You can put logic in and say, what sort of error is it? Does it say timeout? Does it end? Yeah. It depends how intelligent when you write code. So what the worst thing you can do is display some red stuff in PowerShell, which is what errors appear in, because non-PowerShell people go, there's an error, run away. They don't know what to do. So always track errors, and if you can, remediate them yourself or hide them from users. Don't hard code, I said that one. Yeah, always think, what if? What if this isn't passed? What if this is 0? What if this is less than 0? Always sanity check stuff. Don't assume that the person using it is going to be saying, I say watch for internet, and tight loops is a loop that's going round and round like that. So without a sleep in it, sleeps I don't really like using, because I think it should be event driven, but for the rest stuff, kind of need to use it. And make sure if you've got a loop that's going round, that there's a way you can break out of it, rather than someone's waiting there for 3 hours going, it's going to finish, it's going to finish. Either your logic's wrong and you didn't stop the error, or there's a problem with Azure. So how long is a decent amount of time? Again, you just define it as a number of seconds or minutes, and in your loop, you just record what time you started, add a number of seconds, minutes, whatever to that, and if the current time is greater than that, you go, timeout. Yeah. So always think, what could go wrong with this code? I've already said this, meaningful variable names, parameter names, etc. Then there are plenty of examples out there. So I've got a GitHub repo with 130 plus scripts of various descriptions, Windows troubleshooting, Citrix stuff, VMware stuff. There's not a huge amount of Azure stuff on there, but most of my Azure stuff is on the control script library. The 2 scripts I've used today, one is there at the moment, that's activity logs. The creating new VMs isn't quite finished that one yet. It's pretty much there, but again, I like to test all this stuff to breaking point, try and break things and see, if I stop creation of the VM through the portal, for instance, how does my code cope? My code creator cope? But that's what this last example is all about, is have the people whose code you're using, which is not a problem, people put code out there to be used, but have they thought about that? Have they got the same mindset as me in terms of error checking and everything else? Plenty of people do, but plenty of people don't. A lot of the PowerShell I get asked to comment on by colleagues and so on is where the code itself does the job, which is great, which is the most important thing with any PowerShell or any program, that it does what you set out to solve. But what happens if that fails? What happens if that fails? Is error checking and doing something sensible, because it might mean that you just get a lot of redness on the screen from PowerShell with lots of errors, but it might mean you do the wrong thing in the wrong place and you break something big style. Let's create this folder. And okay, that didn't work. So I couldn't copy the files in, but the stuff to delete it still works. But I wasn't in that folder, I was in system 32. Oh shit. And if you do reuse other people's scripts, it's always nice to give them credit. Yeah. So I'll comment, this is where I borrowed. This script has come from there. And if it's something you're willing to give back to the community, give back to the community. I have my day job writing stuff for money, and my evening job is doing community scripts and other things. I think, that could be useful to people. I think that's it. I don't know how long I've tried next time. How long was I talking for? How many hours?
It's Thursday.
I wasn't too bad.
Any questions for the guy? Private pizza. Thank you very much, guy.
Thank you.
So for those who are remote, that is the end of the session. Those who are in person, pizza is at the back. So thank you everybody for joining. Thanks to Richard and Guy for speaking. Yeah, so it's been a very, very successful first hybrid event. I think probably virtual next month, but we will be doing this again at some point. So thanks to Net Company for sponsoring us, sponsoring the drinks. Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for having us.